Savannah, 1852. The city breathes with the humid air of summer. Its streets lined with moss-draped oaks and brick-front warehouses stacked high with cotton. The wealth of the South pulses through its docks. Wagons heavy with bales destined for Europe. On those streets, men tip their hats, women shield their faces from the glare, and enslaved workers toil under watchful eyes. Yet amid the ordinary bustle of a growing port city, there stood one place that refused to sound like the rest of Savannah. It was St. Perpetua's Chapel, a church with walls thick enough to hold in its secrets, and a roof that never rang with the call of bells. No bell ever tolled there. Not for births, not for weddings, not for deaths. In a city where sound was woven into daily life, hammer on anvil, cries of vendors, the toll of ship clocks, the silence of this chapel was startling, unnatural. The locals would say in hushed voices that it was built this way by design, that they didn't want anyone to hear. Even before whispers of disappearances began, suspicion clung to its stone, a chapel that could summon no flock, a sanctuary that could not announce joy or grief, became something darker in the public mind, a house that did not wish to be noticed. The records, sparse though they are, confirm that the omission was not an accident. In early architectural notes, later retrieved from county archives, the line for belfry is struck through in a clerk's neat hand. No explanation accompanies the change. No parish minutes record a discussion. For most churches, the bell was not ornament but necessity, the voice of the parish, the heart of the community. Its absence here was a wound dressed as piety. One contemporary journalist remarked, "It is a house that cannot cry out." To understand how strange this was, one must recall Savannah in those years. The city was both flourishing and sickly, alive with commerce, but haunted by epidemics of yellow, fever that arrived with the ships. Life and death mingled in close quarters, and bells were central to daily rhythm. They rang to announce services, funerals, alarms. Their resonance stretched across the marshes and the river, binding neighborhoods together. To build a chapel without such a voice was to declare silence over a people. And silence, as history would reveal, can be more deadly than sound. The mystery of St. Perpetua's has survived because of the toll it failed to ring. We know the names of some who vanished inside its walls, though not all. We know the letters written by parents, the journal of an alienist, the ledger of a sheriff, all pieces scattered through archives and personal collections. We also know that the diocese worked hard to obscure much of it, sealing files and discouraging inquiry. But the fact remains. Across several years in the mid-19th century, people entered that chapel and did not return. Their absence was marked not by alarm, not by the urgent clamor of iron on iron, but by an unbroken quiet. Silence can be holy. It can be a space for prayer, for contemplation, for retreat from the world. But silence can also conceal. It can smother cries for help. It can turn a public building into a private tomb. In this story, silence is both the tool and the symbol, the deliberate absence of bells, the refusal of institutions to acknowledge the missing, the whispered warnings dismissed as superstition. Savannah, with its bustling streets and its deep river harbor, kept moving forward, but inside that chapel, time itself seemed to stand still, locked beneath stone and silence. It is here that our story begins, with the most startling fact of all, that in a city where bells marked every passage of life, one chapel never rang out, not once. And because of that silence, too many lives disappeared without witness, without warning, without the dignity of being heard. What follows is not a tale told for thrill or spectacle, but a reconstruction drawn from fragments of the past. It is important to state clearly, at the outset, that what you are about to hear has been pieced together from court filings, parish letters, private journals, and survivor testimony, some reliable, some disputed, many incomplete. The details you will encounter are unsettling. They involve the disappearance of children, the silencing of women, the complicity of trusted institutions. For that reason, listener discretion is urged. No depictions here will linger on violence for its own sake, but the grief of families and the shadows of exploitation cannot be softened entirely. To do otherwise would be to betray those whose voices were already muted by time and by authority. This note is necessary because stories like this one tread a difficult line. On the one hand, they fascinate, history wrapped in mystery, the lure of secrets long buried. On the other hand, they touch real wounds. We must balance curiosity with care. Every detail we reconstruct risks reopening. Questions for descendants who still live in Savannah, and for communities whose histories are already marked by erasure. The difference between remembrance and exploitation lies in intention, to honor the lost rather than to consume them. So let us be clear, some aspects of this narrative remain speculative, where a diary trails into illegibility, where a parish record has been amended with a blot of ink, where testimony is preserved only secondhand. We will note the uncertainty. You deserve to know when the ground beneath the story is firm and when it is shifting. We will not pretend to certainty where there is none. Transparency is not decoration here. It is duty. And yet duty does not strip away the unease. Even fragments can carry weight. A single line from a bishop's letter, there must be no resonance, can speak volumes about what leaders feared the community might hear. A small inventory of objects, shoes, ribbons, broken rosaries, can speak louder than any official report. We cannot give these artifacts back to the people who owned them, but we can let them speak where bells did not. The contrast is unavoidable. The sanctity of the chapel as consecrated space against the cruelty of its silence when families cried out for answers. Sacred ground is meant to heal, but in this story, it concealed. Where bells should have signaled weddings or funerals, there was nothing. That void is not neutral. It is oppressive. It is the very absence of sound that shapes the terror here, the refusal of institutions to acknowledge what was happening in their midst. Before we proceed into the unfolding of events, a small request. Consider this story not as distant history, but as part of the same human pattern we still inhabit. Think of the places in your own town or city that hold secrets. The locked buildings no one explains, the empty lots with histories no one tells. Silence is not only a feature of the past, it lives among us still. As you listen, I invite you to share where you are listening from. This community of listeners is itself a form of witness, a way to make sure that what was once kept quiet does not remain so. Now, with that framework of care and clarity established, we can return to Savannah in the 1850s too. The streets where cotton dust clung to every surface, where the air smelled of river tide and decay, and where a chapel without bells sat waiting, its silence already holding more than prayer. Savannah in the early 1850s was a city of sharp contrasts, a place that seemed on its surface to thrive, yet underneath carried layers of fear and fragility. Along the waterfront, ships from Liverpool, Boston, and Havana docked daily, their hulls loaded with cotton so tightly packed it threatened to burst the seams of the vessels. Cotton was wealth. Cotton was power. The merchants in their white linen suits and polished boots strutted along Bay Street, proud of the fortunes they extracted from a crop raised on the backs of enslaved laborers. For them, Savannah was a jewel of the South, a city of order, commerce, and civility. But beyond the orderly avenues, another truth persisted. Behind those proud facades, epidemics of yellow fever cut down the population in waves. Behind those great houses, enslaved families lived in constant terror of being separated, sold, or punished. The city's prosperity was built on a knife's edge. To walk Savannah then was to experience this double life. The grand squares, Johnson, Wright, Telfair, offered shade beneath spreading oaks, with benches where the wealthy might gossip. At the same time, narrow alleys stank of human waste and rotting food, places where children played barefoot and hungry. The clatter of wagon wheels carried down cobblestones, while just a few streets away, the cries of the enslaved at the auction block pierced the humid air. The social order demanded silence from some and celebrated the voices of others. The contrast was relentless, beauty against misery, harmony against dissonance. Religion, too, reflected this duality. Savannah boasted fine churches, Episcopal, Baptist, Methodist, Catholic, each competing for moral authority. Their bells rang with regularity, calling the faithful to worship and marking the milestones of life. The faithful believed those bells kept the city tethered to God, a reassurance that even amid sickness and death, divine order persisted. Yet within this landscape rose St. Perpetua's Chapel, built in brick and stone on a quiet edge of the city. It was consecrated with the same pomp as the others, but its silence marked it as different from the start. Where other churches sought to declare themselves in sound, this one concealed itself in muteness. Its neighbors whispered about the decision, but life moved too quickly for questions to take root. Still, silence leaves space for rumor, and rumor is never idle in a port city. Sailors spoke of hearing voices near the chapel late at night, voices not belonging to any congregation. Mothers warned their children to avoid its yard after sundown, fearing things best left unsaid. Even the enslaved workers conscripted to maintain the chapel grounds left testimonies. later recorded in fragmented oral histories, describing strange movements of earth near the crypt after storms. Their observations, of course, were dismissed by the men in charge. In a city ordered by hierarchy, the words of the poor and the enslaved carried little weight. Disease shaped everything. The fever came on ships as easily as spices or cloth. It would settle in the marsh air, striking suddenly, without regard for age or wealth. Families could be halved in a matter of days. Graves filled quickly, bells tolled endlessly, and citizens lived with the sense that death lurked around every corner. This constant proximity to loss made the disappearances at St. Perpetua's even harder to recognize at first. Was it fever that took the girl, the wife, the choristers? Or was something more deliberate concealed? Beneath the chapel's quiet stone walls, in a city where coffins passed daily, one absence could too easily be folded into the larger silence of epidemic death. The elite had little interest in drawing attention to shadows. Merchants wanted investors to believe Savannah was secure, orderly, blessed with divine favor. Clergy wanted their congregations confident in the stability of their church. Lawmen wanted their records to show control. Admitting that people were vanishing from a consecrated space would have cracked that facade. And so silence, once again, was the tool. Silence from the chapel, silence from the authorities, silence pressed upon the families of the missing. This is why St. Perpetua's chapel fit so seamlessly into Savannah's uneasy balance. The city itself was built on contradictions. Wealth built on bondage, health perched over plague, beauty shading brutality. A chapel that did not call out with bells, that swallowed people without explanation, was only an extension of what Savannah already was. The people of the city may have felt something wrong at its core, but they were trained, generation by generation, to endure contradictions without protest. In that sense, the chapel was not an aberration. It was Savannah in miniature. The consecration of St. Perpetua's chapel was meant to be a triumph for Savannah's Catholic community, a demonstration of permanence in a city where Protestant denominations held most of the power. In early 1852, parishioners dressed in their Sunday best crowded the narrow street as clerics, processed in full vestments. Incense clouded the humid air, mingling with the smell of river mud and tar from the docks. Prayers were recited, hymns sung, holy water sprinkled upon the stone. To the casual eye, the day was marked by all the ceremony one might expect of a new house of God. Yet beneath the solemn grandeur, there was one detail that every eye noticed, though few dared to voice aloud, the empty tower above them. A belfry built without a bell. In Catholic tradition, bells were not mere instruments but sacramentals, blessed to drive away storms, to summon the faithful, to mark sacred time. A chapel without bells was like a body without a voice. Parishioners muttered to one another about the oddity, asking quietly when the bell would be cast, or why it had not yet been installed. The priests offered vague reassurances. In due time, when funds allow. But the truth, as later documents suggest, was far more deliberate. In the architectural drafts preserved in county files, the original design had included a bell, noted with measurements and weight. That line was later struck through in neat script, the margin initialed with the letters of an overseer. No explanation survives beyond that silent act of erasure. The absence changed the mood of the place. Where other chapels rang joyfully on their first day, calling out to every corner of their parish, St. Perpetua's opened in quiet. The crowd dispersed not to the sound of triumph, but to the shuffle of feet on cobblestones. That silence became the building's first reputation. Children joked nervously that the church forgot its tongue. Sailors quartered nearby said a chapel without bells was like a ship, without a mast, dangerous, incomplete. Among the devout, the silence was harder to ignore. They were taught that bells sanctified space, that their sound pushed back against the devil's intrusion. If no bells rang, what forces might be allowed to creep in unopposed? Not all found the omission sinister. Some wealthier parishioners defended it, insisting the funds had simply run short, or that a more elaborate casting was planned for the future. Others suggested a more practical reason, that the chapel sat on softer ground, and a heavy bell might destabilize its foundation. These explanations soothed those who wished to believe. But as months passed and no casting order was ever placed, patience began to fray. Rumors multiplied. Some claimed the diocese itself had forbidden the bell, fearful of resonance from the tower disturbing something beneath the structure. Others whispered that silence was demanded for reasons never written, reasons known only to those who had approved the design. The building itself carried an unease that visitors often remarked upon. Its nave was narrow, its windows smaller than those of other churches. Light seemed to fall reluctantly through the stained glass, pooling in corners rather than spilling across the pews, without the punctuating cry of a bell to break the stillness. Services there felt heavy, muffled, as though the walls absorbed rather than reflected sound. Parishioners sometimes described the sensation of voices being swallowed, as if hymns ended before they reached the rafters. Silence lingered between prayers longer than it should, and even the echo of footsteps felt subdued. From the very first year, townspeople began referring to St. Perpetua's as the chapel without bells. It became less a description and more a title, one that carried suspicion. Mothers warned their children against straying too near its yard after dusk. Carpenters working on nearby houses claimed they heard noises at night, faint vibrations through the ground, though no bell ever rang to account for them. The silence was not absence but presence, dense, waiting, charged. It was as though the omission itself had become the chapel's character, defining it more strongly than any hymn or homily within. By removing the voice of the church, those who designed it set in motion a story larger than they could have foreseen. Silence would become its symbol and its curse. The chapel's consecration, intended as a day of celebration, instead planted the first seed of dread in Savannah's imagination. From that moment forward, every disappearance, every unanswered cry, every rumor of footsteps in the crypt would be measured against the silence of those bells that never rang. The first disappearance that history records occurred in the spring of 1853, scarcely a year after the consecration. The victim was a child, an orphaned girl of perhaps 9 years old, though her exact age is uncertain because the records differ. She had no surname in the ledgers, only Eliza, written in a parish hand. What is known is that she had been born without speech. Those who knew her described her as quiet but quick to smile, a child who communicated with her eyes, her gestures, the scribbles she made in chalk on slates. To a community that already marked her as different, the absence of her voice was treated as a burden, something to be managed. When she was placed in the care of St. Perpetua's, few questioned it. A chapel without bells taking in a child without words. Savannah's people found symmetry in the silence, though it was a cruel symmetry. The official reason was charity. The parish, newly consecrated, wished to demonstrate its compassion. But the orphanage records suggest another motive. Notes in the county ledger reveal that the larger institutions were overcrowded, unwilling to house another mute dependent. It was easier to pass her to the smaller chapel, whose staff insisted they could tend to her. She was delivered with a small satchel containing a book primer, some stitching needles, and a single dress folded neatly by the matron who surrendered her. Eliza was seen often in the chapel yard during that first season. Children from neighboring houses described watching her trace letters in the dirt with a stick, always practicing her name. She was gentle with animals, feeding stray cats with scraps from the kitchen. A few women who attended Mass said she would smile brightly at them but never linger, always pulled away by the hand of a caretaker. Her presence was noted but never celebrated. In a city where children's laughter was common, hers was a quiet, spectral companionship, tolerated more than cherished. One evening in late May, a thunderstorm swept across Savannah, the kind that rolled in from the river with sudden violence. Neighbors recalled seeing lightning flash across the chapel roof, illuminating its mute belfry. In the confusion of rain and wind, the orphan girl vanished. She was last seen sitting in the nave, tracing letters in her primer by the light of a candle. By morning, she was gone. The official explanation came swiftly and coldly. The matron declared that Eliza had wandered off, perhaps seeking shelter from the storm. The river, swollen by rain, was a ready scapegoat. Children stray and children drown, one parish clerk wrote in a margin note. No search parties were organized. The sheriff, when questioned later, admitted that no missing person record was filed. She was an orphan, he said, with no family to demand her return. In a city already overwhelmed by fever and poverty, one child's absence was not considered news. But whispers contradicted the official line. A neighbor woman claimed she heard faint pounding during the storm, strikes, like fists against wood, but could not determine their source. Another said she saw a candle still burning in the chapel long after the priests had retired, flickering unnaturally against the stained glass. These accounts were dismissed as imagination fueled by thunder. Yet weeks later, a A gardener discovered something beneath the flagstones in the chapel crypt. A single page from a child's primer, torn and damp, the edges blackened as if scorched. The letters traced on it, clumsy but distinct, formed the word "Here." That page survives today, preserved in the county archive, brittle and faded. It is the first artifact of St. Perpetua's silence, and it is chilling. The irony is unmistakable. A mute child leaving behind a plea for hearing in a chapel that had refused a bell. Whether she intended the word as a prayer, a warning, or the last mark of a frightened hand, no one can say. But for those who found it, the implication was too sharp to ignore. The girl had not drowned in the river. She had been silenced inside the very place meant to protect her. In the months that followed, life in Savannah moved forward, as it always did. Cotton was shipped, sermons preached, families buried. But for those who had seen the child, who remembered her smile and her silent letters, the absence lingered. They watched the chapel more closely now, unsettled by its stillness. What had once been peculiar now seemed ominous. And though no bells rang for Eliza, the silence itself began to sound like accusation. It was the summer of 1854 when the second disappearance darkened St. Perpetua's name. This time it was no orphan or outsider, but a woman tied closely to the chapel itself. The young wife of the sexton, a man entrusted with the daily care of the building. Her name was Margaret Hale, scarcely 20 years old, married less than 2 years, with no children yet. The sexton, Thomas Hale, was known throughout the parish as dutiful, plain-spoken, a man of modest means but unquestioned loyalty to the church. Margaret, by contrast, was remembered as lively, too quick to laugh at times, a woman whose spirit seemed ill-fitted to the somber quiet of St. Perpetua's. Margaret had confided to neighbors that she disliked being left alone in the vestry while her husband worked in the nave or attended to the grounds. She claimed she often heard faint murmurs beneath the floorboards, voices that seemed to rise from the crypt below. Thomas dismissed this as imagination or the sounds of shifting soil after storms. But her fear deepened. In a letter to her sister, preserved in a private family collection, Margaret wrote, "It is as if the very stones of this place breathe when I am still. The floor shakes without step. And sometimes I hear what I know is not my name, but feels like it is meant for me." On an August evening, with the air heavy and oppressive, Margaret accompanied her husband to the chapel, as she often did. He went about his routine, trimming lamps, sweeping the nave, checking the doors. She lingered in the vestry, folding linens and straightening vestments. At some point during the night, Thomas left her briefly to fetch oil from the shed. When he returned, Margaret was gone. The vestry door was closed but unbarred. Her work half finished, a folded cloth still in her hand. No one saw her leave. No footprints were found outside. And her shawl remained draped over the back of a chair. Panic set in. Thomas searched the grounds with a lantern until dawn, his shouts echoing unanswered. Neighbors joined him, combing the nearby alleys and riverfront. But nothing emerged. By morning, suspicion turned upon Thomas himself. Whispers of marital discord spread quickly, stoked by the church's eagerness to deflect any hint of scandal within its walls. The sheriff questioned him harshly, noting the lack of evidence for an abduction. The implication was clear: a husband alone with his wife, a sudden disappearance, no witnesses. Even Margaret's own family, desperate for explanation, wondered aloud if violence had lurked beneath their seemingly quiet marriage. Yet there were other details that would not fit the accusation. Thomas swore he had heard something strange in the moments before he discovered her absence. A low humming beneath the vestry floor, rhythmic like a chant, stopping only when he flung open the door. He described the smell of smoke, though no lamp had spilled, and the air, he said, felt close, as if the room itself had swallowed breath. His testimony was dismissed as grief-ridden delusion, the desperate invention of a man under suspicion. But the words found their way into the sheriff's ledger, preserved in thin, faded ink, a detail that future investigators would seize upon. In the weeks that followed, Margaret was never found. No body surfaced in the river, no trace of her appeared in nearby towns. The case against Thomas faltered for lack of evidence, but suspicion clung to him. Parishioners avoided his eyes, whispered behind his back. His work at the chapel became unbearable, the silence of the belfry pressing down like a weight. Eventually he resigned his post and left Savannah altogether, broken by loss and by doubt. His wife's name was never spoken in sermons. Her absence was treated as a private failing, not a public mystery. The contrast here could not have been sharper. Where Eliza's disappearance, had been neglected because she was voiceless, and without kin. Margaret's was buried under the assumption of domestic crime. In both cases, the institution of the church evaded scrutiny, turning attention elsewhere, toward the river, toward the husband, anywhere but toward the chapel itself. Once again, silence prevailed, the silence of bells on cast, of authorities unwilling to confront what was happening within sacred walls. Years later, when Thomas was an old man living in obscurity in Charleston, he told a visiting nephew that he still heard his wife's voice at night, not in dreams but in the walls of his room, whispering in tones he could not quite decipher. They wanted no one to hear, he muttered. But I still do. That confession, written down in the nephew's diary, became one of the many artifacts that point back to St. Perpetua's and its legacy of vanishing. The third disappearance came in the autumn of 1855, and with it the silence of St. Perpetua's could no longer be ignored. This time it was not an orphan tucked away on the margins, nor a wife whose vanishing could be blamed on her husband, but 3 adolescent boys, members of the chapel's own choir. Their names survive in parish notes and family Bibles. Daniel Cross, age 12, son of a carpenter. Peter Alvarez, age 13, of a merchant family recently arrived from Havana. And Samuel Wright, age 14, whose father was a cooper. They were ordinary boys by every account, mischievous, fond of play, but their voices were prized by the chapel. In a house without bells, their harmonies became its only music. The boys were last seen on an October evening. A storm was threatening the coast, and the air hung thick with the scent of rain and brine. They had gathered in the nave for a routine choir practice under the supervision of the choirmaster, who stepped away briefly to fetch hymnals from the sacristy. When he returned, the pews were empty, their music books left open on the benches. At first he assumed the boys had wandered outside, restless and distracted as boys often are. But minutes turned to an hour, lanterns were lit, and the search began. They were nowhere to be found. By dawn, panic spread through Savannah. 3 children from respectable families had vanished within consecrated walls. Unlike the orphan or the sexton's wife, these boys could not be dismissed quietly. Their parents demanded answers. The sheriff dispatched men to scour the riverbanks, to question dock workers, to inspect the marshes. But as with the earlier disappearances, there were no tracks, no signs of struggle, no bodies. The only trace left behind was the unsettling arrangement of their hymnals, each open to the same page, Psalm 94, O Lord God, to whom vengeance belongeth, show thyself. The choir master later swore under oath that he had not set the books that way. Some speculated that the boys themselves had left them as a message, though how they could have conspired in so short a time remains unclear. Others whispered darker theories, that something beneath the chapel had taken them, that the boys had been swallowed into the same silence that had consumed the others. Testimonies recorded years later describe townsfolk standing outside St. Perpetua's on the night after the disappearance, straining their ears to hear anything at all. But all that met them was the unbroken stillness of the unringing tower. Public pressure grew intolerable. Families threatened lawsuits. Newspapers carried the story in cautious tones, and the diocese scrambled to protect its reputation. Officials repeated the familiar excuses: the river, kidnappers, runaway boys. Yet few believed them. These were children with no cause to flee, boys who had families waiting at home. They had been safe inside a chapel, or so everyone had believed. Now the church that had sworn to shield them stood accused, if not in court, then in the whispers of the street. The contrast was glaring. Where bells in other parishes would have tolled an alarm, calling neighbors to aid in the search, St. Perpetua's remained mute. Its tower stood dark against the storm. Its silence felt like complicity. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers spoke of pulling their families from the congregation. Yet the church hierarchy refused to install a bell, refused even to acknowledge that its absence had become a symbol of dread. In that refusal, suspicion hardened into something closer to conviction. That silence was not a flaw, but a choice, and that the choice served some purpose not meant for the faithful to know. For the first time, Savannah began to see the pattern. A mute orphan, a sexton's wife, 3 choristers all gone, all within the orbit of the chapel. This was no longer coincidence. The city's patience frayed, and with it came anger. Demands rose for the diocese to act, to explain, to investigate. Petitions were drafted insisting that bells be cast and installed at once, their voices to break the chain of vanishings. The bishop, in turn, dismissed these petitions, calling them the noise of fearful hearts. That phrase did nothing to calm the city. If anything, it enraged the grieving families who knew their fear was justified. The silence of St. Perpetua's had grown too loud to ignore, and in that autumn of 1855, it seemed Savannah itself stood at a breaking point. In the wake of the chorister's disappearance, the diocese, eager to quell what it branded panic and superstition, summoned an outsider to Savannah, a man of science rather than faith. His name was Dr. Horace Fielding, an alienist from Philadelphia, trained in the study of the mind and its maladies. At a time when psychology was scarcely recognized as a discipline, alienists were viewed with both fascination and suspicion. Half scientist, half philosopher, Fielding had a reputation for rationalism, for dismissing hauntings and rumors as the symptoms of hysteria, delusion, or collective suggestion. To the bishop, he was the perfect solution, a man who could declare the community's fears unfounded, restoring order through the authority of reason. Fielding arrived in late November 1855, stepping off the steamer in his black coat, notebook in hand. His journal, preserved in part at the Savannah Historical Society, records his first impressions of the city. He noted the peculiar heaviness of the air, weighted by both humidity and expectation, and remarked that the citizens speak of the chapel as though it were an animate thing, possessed of moods. He found this disquieting but also diagnostic, evidence, in his eyes, of a populace succumbing to the contagion of fear. His first task was to interview the families of the missing boys. The Wrights described their son Samuel as steadfast, dutiful with no inclination to run away. The Cross family swore Daniel was fearful of the river and would never have gone near it alone. Peter, Alvarez's mother, clutched her rosary so tightly it left marks on her palms as she told Fielding she heard her son's voice in dreams, always singing the same note, a sound that woke her from sleep. Fielding, in his journal, dismissed these accounts as projections of grief, though he noted their striking consistency. Each family spoke of sound, or the absence of it, as the feature that lingered most. Voices cut off, echoes swallowed, silence pressing down like a weight. When he turned his attention to the chapel itself, Fielding recorded sensations that betrayed his own unease. He wrote, "The architecture is unimposing, the nave narrow, yet the acoustics are peculiar. Words spoken seem to die in mid-air. My own voice feels curtailed. It is an uncanny effect, though one that could be explained by materials and design." Later entries, however, reveal cracks in his confidence. During a solitary inspection of the crypt, he described hearing a faint rhythm like the tapping of distant hammers or the beat of a muffled drum. No one accompanied him, and when he asked the sexton's replacement, a man named Wilkes, if workers had been repairing the foundation, Wilkes swore there had been no such work. Fielding attempted to apply his methods systematically. He conducted group interviews, noting how one person's testimony shaped another's, how fear spread through suggestion. He even staged a small experiment, gathering a few parishioners in the nave at dusk. He asked them to sit in silence while he recorded their physical responses. Several reported dizziness, a sense of pressure in their chests, or the feeling that someone was standing just behind them. Fielding explained it as shared anxiety in a confined space. Still, his journal betrays a faltering certainty. It is one thing to explain fear as contagion. It is another to feel its weight personally. The artifact of his journal is invaluable, not only for what it reveals, but for what it obscures. Several passages are written in Latin shorthand, an odd choice for a man trained to communicate his findings to lay readers. Scholars who later translated these notes found them more troubling than his published accounts. In one, he wrote, "There is concordance between vanishings and absence of resonance. Bells, had they been cast, might have revealed or dispersed what gathers here. Silence, therefore, is no accident but instrument." Such words, hidden from the public in code, suggest that Fielding glimpsed something deeper than hysteria, something structural, perhaps even intentional. Yet when he presented his official report to the bishop, his tone was cautious, dismissive. He concluded that the disappearances, while tragic, were likely the result of runaway intentions or natural misadventure, and that the community's belief in supernatural causes was a form of collective delusion, nurtured by poverty, sickness, and ignorance. The diocese seized upon these words, publishing extracts and pamphlets and distributing them widely. Savannah's fears, they declared, had been soothed by science. But the townspeople who had spoken to Fielding privately knew his words were incomplete. They remembered his pale expression as he emerged from the crypt, the way his hand trembled slightly when he turned a page. They had heard the questions he muttered to himself about resonance, about sound, and they could not forget the coded passages, fragments that circulated quietly among those who sought them, whispered evidence that even a man of reason had felt the silence pressing against his mind. Thus Fielding became another contradiction in the story of St. Perpetua's, summoned to dismiss fear, yet leaving traces that confirmed it, a scientist whose official voice denied what his private pen revealed. His presence did not silence the community, but instead deepened its suspicion, proving once again that what was not spoken openly often mattered more than what was. The groundskeeper's name was Elijah Morton, an elderly man with skin like parchment and hands calloused from decades of tending to St. Perpetua's yard. He had been with the chapel longer than any priest or sexton, longer even than most parishioners could remember. People said Elijah knew every root of the magnolias, every crack in the bricks of the courtyard wall. In Savannah, where memory itself was often passed down through whispers rather than written word, Elijah was considered a living archive. When others dismissed him as senile, families desperate for answers still sought him out. His words, halting though they were, carried the weight of first-hand witness. Morton first spoke under oath during the coroner's inquest convened after the disappearance of the choir boys. Records survive in faded ink. This witness, being sworn, states he has seen lights in the chapel at hours when no service was held. Asked to elaborate, Morton described lamps or lanterns that gave no smoke and cast no shadows. He insisted they flickered within the chapel's nave long after the doors had been locked. When pressed, he added something more disturbing, that the light did not come from above but from below, seeping through the cracks in the floorboards as though the earth itself glowed. The officials recorded his words but seemed eager to discredit him. His age, his occasional stammer, and his humble station were all cited as reasons not to trust him, yet parishioners remembered the consistency of his accounts. He told anyone who would listen that silence in the chapel was not natural, that it had been hammered into the stones. According to Morton, when the chapel was first built, workmen complained that every chisel strike rang strangely muffled, as though the walls absorbed sound. One mason reportedly joked, "The stones have been fed a vow of silence." Morton never laughed at the memory. Years later, in a letter preserved by his granddaughter, Elijah described what he claimed to have heard in the nights after the first disappearance. He wrote, "When the wind is right, I hear them underfoot like children whispering. They do not cry, nor do they pray. They whisper as though they know something we do not. Sometimes it is my name, sometimes only the sound of feet running. The letter bears stains of oil and soil, as though it had been carried in his pocket for years before being passed on." Perhaps the most unsettling detail he gave, though rarely in public, concerned the tower. To outsiders, St. Perpetua's bell tower stood empty, no bronze ever hung there. But Morton insisted that on certain nights, especially when the tide was high, he could hear the phantom strike of a bell that did not exist. "Not loud," he told a neighbor once. "It don't peal. It thuds like metal smothered in cloth, but you feel it here." And he would touch his chest just above his heart. Artifacts corroborate portions of his story. In an 1856 inventory of diocesan correspondence, a marginal note refers to E. Morton's complaint regarding nocturnal luminescence. Another, preserved in the bishop's own hand, states simply, Morton should be guided to silence. His words are unfit for parish ears. That word, silence, repeats like a refrain in every piece of this archive, as though the very policy of the diocese was not to investigate but to still the voices of those who had seen too much. The contrast in Morton's case is stark. To the diocese, he was a feeble old man whose words endangered order. To grieving families, he was the only one brave enough to say aloud what others felt. That the chapel's silence was alive, that it drew the missing downward, that it was no accident the tower had been left voiceless. He embodied the tension between lived experience and institutional denial, between testimony rooted in soil and memory, and the polished assurances of bishops and doctors. By the time Morton passed away in 1858, his testimony had taken on the shape of folklore. Children dared one another to stand outside the chapel at night and listen for the bell that wasn't there. Parents warned them away, yet the legend persisted. For some, his words were madness, for others, prophecy. But for all who heard him, they lodged like a seed of doubt, proof that someone close to the chapel had seen and heard what others were forbidden to admit. The first true artifacts surfaced not from the vaults of the diocese, but from a far humbler source. The trunk of a widow who lived 2 streets east of St. Perpetua's. Her name was Margaret Hanley, and she had once kept house for the parish priests. When her son fell ill and died in 1856, she left service abruptly, taking with her only what fit into a cedar trunk. After her death some years later, that trunk passed to her niece, who discovered within it a bundle of bound journals, parish notes, and folded sheets scrawled in a cramped hand. The niece, having heard whispers of the chapel's history, delivered them to a local historian in 1872. They remain among the most disturbing records we possess. The journals belonged to Father Ambrose, the parish priest who oversaw St. Perpetua's during the years of the vanishings. In public he was known as a mild man, solemn and pious, a shepherd to his flock. But in his private writing, a different voice emerges, uncertain, fretful, and burdened with secrets. His earliest entries speak innocuously of daily sermons and collections. Yet by the winter of 1854 his tone shifts. He begins to note unexplained absences during evening prayers, strange resonances when hymns were sung, and his own unease at remaining in the chapel after dusk. One entry reads, "When the choir sings, there are tones I do not recall teaching them. Notes slip in like shadows, not born of any throat I can see. The sound chills the marrow. Afterward the children appear dazed, unable to describe what they felt. Such words, never meant for public eyes, suggest Ambrose had perceived an intrusion in the very fabric of worship, an invisible accompaniment to the human voices." The folded parish notes add another layer. Several are written in a cipher, Latin words reversed or replaced with symbols, as though meant to obscure them from casual readers. Once decoded, they reveal orders from higher diocesan offices. One directive, dated May 1855, instructs, the tower must remain mute. No casting of bells is permitted, lest the resonance provoke what lies beneath. Another reads, continue services as usual. Acknowledge no disappearances within parish records. Silence is the surest safeguard. The word silence again, always silence, not as absence but as policy. The contrast between Ambrose's private fear and the diocese's cold directives is striking. The priest, in his journals, pleads for guidance. How am I to tend a flock when wolves enter unseen, when their cries are swallowed before they can be raised? Yet the hierarchy responds not with aid but with insistence upon secrecy. The man charged with protecting his congregation is rendered powerless, bound by obedience to silence the very voices of the suffering. Perhaps the most haunting artifact is a fragment of a sermon draft, never delivered. On a scrap of parchment, Ambrose wrote, "The chapel has no bells, but it rings with what they would banish. I fear that every missing soul has not departed but lingers, woven into the stones. Should we toll a bell, I believe they would answer." The draft ends abruptly, the ink trailing off as though the pen had been pulled from his hand. Historians debate why Margaret Hanley preserved these documents. Did she suspect their significance? Or did she simply keep them as a relic of service to a priest she pitied? Whatever her motive, the preservation of these artifacts transformed rumor into testimony. They showed, in tangible form, that the silences were not mere superstition, but sanctioned, crafted by deliberate decree. When these papers were revealed in the 1870s, decades after the events, they shocked Savannah's newer generation. For the first time, citizens could read with their own eyes that their fears had been justified, that voices of protest had been stifled from the top down. The journals lent weight to what Elijah Morton had testified, what grieving families had suspected, what Dr. Fielding had coded in his shorthand, but never spoken aloud. Artifacts are often described as proof, but here they function as something darker, a mirror. They show not only what was hidden, but how carefully it was hidden, how silence became a tool wielded by authority. They prove that while the chapel lacked bells, it did not lack resonance. The resonance was human, suppressed voices, muffled cries, erased names, and it reverberates, still through the fragile pages of those journals. By the spring of 1856, the tension in Savannah could no longer be contained. The discovery of Father Ambrose's private journals passed hand to hand in whispers before the diocese could suppress them, had ignited something raw in the town. Families who had once accepted the priest's nervous smiles, now saw his silence as complicity. Men gathered in taverns to debate whether the church itself was harboring the missing. Women, who had once tiptoed past St. Perpetua's, now stood defiantly in its yard, clutching rosaries and demanding that the tower be fitted with bells. Silence had been endured for too long. The diocese responded with edicts and threats. The bishop issued a pastoral letter, condemning those who sow disorder. Through unverified writings, he warned parishioners that salvation lay in obedience, not in heedless clamor. Copies of the letter were nailed to the chapel's doors. Yet the more the diocese invoked obedience, the more Savannah bristled. Ordinary citizens had buried too many without explanation. Their patience, like their trust, was gone. The first open confrontation erupted in May, on a sweltering afternoon when townsfolk assembled at the chapel steps. Witness accounts describe nearly 200 men. Women and children gathered, holding signs painted with rough slogans, "Let the bells speak," "Bring back our sons," and "Silence is high." Sin. They demanded that the doors be opened, that a search be conducted of the crypt and foundations. For once, they would not be placated by vague assurances. Inside, the clergy barred the doors. Priests stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking entry, their faces pale and set. One held a cross aloft as though warding off an invading army. The bishop himself did not appear, but a message was delivered. No unauthorized entry would be permitted, and any attempt to breach the chapel would be considered sacrilege. The contrast could not have been sharper. Outside, grieving families seeking truth. Inside, officials defending stone and silence as though it were holier than human lives. Witnesses say the crowd surged forward more than once, pounding fists against the locked doors until the wood splintered. Yet each time something uncanny stilled them. A soundless pressure descended, as though the air itself grew heavy. Several reported a ringing in their ears, not the high chime of bells, but a dull, internal vibration that left them gasping. Mothers clutched children who suddenly wept without knowing why. The mob faltered, their courage thinning in the weight of that inexplicable silence. It was at that moment, according to testimony later given by Elijah Morton's nephew, that an elderly woman stepped forward. She was Sarah Calloway, grandmother to one of the missing choir boys. In a clear, trembling voice, she cried, "If God will not speak here, then we shall." She struck the chapel door with her walking stick, each blow echoing louder than seemed possible. The crowd took up the rhythm, pounding fists and sticks in unison, their makeshift percussion rolling through the square. For a fleeting instant, Savannah heard what it had been denied, a chorus of sound rising against the imposed stillness. But the church retaliated swiftly. Within days, the sheriff, acting under pressure from diocesan leaders, arrested several of the protest ringleaders on charges of disturbing the peace. Among them was Calloway herself, who was dragged to jail despite her age. News of her arrest only inflamed the town further. Newspapers sympathetic to the diocese printed stern rebukes, calling the demonstrators hysterics, but alternative. Broadsides circulated. By hand told a different story, of a mother's courage, of a people confronting an institution that had failed them. The confrontation marked a turning point. Trust between the diocese and Savannah was ruptured. Parishioners began leaving St. Perpetua's in droves, seeking worship elsewhere, some even turning to makeshift gatherings in private homes. Attendance fell, collections dwindled, and the once proud chapel began to stand half-empty during services. Yet the tower loomed all the more menacing in its silence, as though mocking those who dared challenge it. The artifact trail confirms this shift. A confiscated petition, preserved in court archives, bears nearly 200 signatures demanding an independent inquiry. Scrawled across the top in the bishop's own hand are the words, "Suppress this. Silence must prevail." It is a chilling reminder that the conflict was not merely between faith and doubt, but between voices demanding to be heard and an authority committed to muting them at any cost. By the summer, Savannah found itself in open conflict, not with an external enemy, but with its own chapel, its own leaders, its own silence. And in that widening rift, the ground was laid for something darker still. The night when secrecy could no longer contain what stirred beneath. St. Perpetua's stones. It happened on a night of oppressive heat in late August 1856, when the air was so still even the cicadas fell quiet. Savannah had been stewing for months, its patience spent, its grief raw. The arrests of protesters, the bishop's refusal to yield, the continuing trickle of rumors. Each had tightened the pressure, until something had to give. That night it did. By torchlight, a crowd of nearly 50 men and women converged on St. Perpetua's. They came not with banners or prayers, but with hammers, crowbars, and lanterns. Some carried pistols, though most wielded only tools meant to pry open what had been locked away. Among them were fathers of the vanished boys, brothers of the missing women, neighbors weary of silence. This was no formal petition. It was desperation turned into resolve. Their intent was clear: to search the chapel themselves, with or without sanction. They approached quietly, avoiding the main road. Witnesses later recalled the sight of the black tower against the starless sky, its silhouette like a sentinel. The doors, already scarred from earlier protests, resisted their blows. It took nearly half an hour of pounding before the wood gave way with a thunderous crack. The sound was jarring in its rarity. The chapel had long seemed to devour noise, but on that night the splintering door rang out across the square like a gunshot. Some swore they heard an answering vibration deep within the tower, as if stone itself shuddered. Inside, the nave was suffocatingly dark. Their lanterns revealed pews in neat rows, hymnals aligned, an altar draped in linen. Nothing seemed amiss, yet unease settled quickly. The air was heavier inside, thick and damp, carrying a faint odor of brine, as though the sea had crept inland and pooled beneath the floor. Every footstep echoed strangely, truncated, as if walls swallowed the sound before it could return. The raiders moved cautiously, some prying open cabinets, others descending into the crypt beneath the nave. There the true disquiet began. The stone steps led to chambers lined with burial niches, where coffins lay stacked in disarray. Several had been broken open, the remains inside disturbed. But it was not bones that caught their attention most. It was the markings carved into the stone, concentric circles, sigils resembling bells, and inscriptions in Latin that translated roughly to sound withheld, suffering contained. One of the men, a carpenter named Josiah Green, swore that as soon as their lantern light touched these carvings, the temperature dropped sharply. He described hearing whispers, faint and overlapping, like dozens of voices speaking at once from behind the walls. Others claimed to hear footsteps above, though no clergy had been seen since the raid began. A woman collapsed, overcome by nausea, insisting she felt children pressing against her, unseen hands tugging at her skirt. Artifacts from that night survive only in fragments. Green later scribbled his recollections on scraps of wood, too frightened to put them to paper. Another raider who fled and confessed under interrogation left a deposition noting that one chamber contained rows of shoes, small and worn, arranged as if in tribute. Whether this detail was invention, memory, or delirium remains debated, but its consistency with earlier accounts of missing belongings gives it grim plausibility. The most chilling moment came when the crowd, gathered in the crypt's largest chamber, struck upon a sealed iron door. It was riveted into the stone without handle or hinge, as though meant never to be opened. The carvings around it bore the image of a bell with a cross struck through it. As the raiders debated forcing it, the air grew intolerably still. Lantern flames guttered, though no draft blew. Then a sound, not a bell, but something like it. A deep metallic resonance that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. It was not heard with the ears so much as felt in the chest, in the teeth. Several dropped their tools and fled. Panic spread quickly. Those who remained shouted to retreat, to leave the place before the door yielded. Some stumbled up the stairs, others collided in their haste. In the chaos, lanterns fell and shattered, scattering oil across the stone. Flames licked briefly at the crypt walls before dying in the damp air. When the survivors emerged into the square, their faces were pale, their bodies trembling. Not one spoke of triumph. Instead, they carried only fear. The raid was never officially acknowledged. The sheriff's men dispersed the survivors, confiscated what tools they could, and issued stern warnings. The diocese declared the damage an act of vandalism by godless agitators and forbade further intrusion. But in taverns and back alleys, the story spread of carvings, whispers, shoes, and the iron door that groaned as though something behind it yearned to speak. The contrast of that night could not be sharper. Townsfolk demanding sound, answers, and justice. The chapel responding with a resonance that was not human, not natural but undeniable. What was meant to expose truth instead deepened the mystery, leaving Savannah more fractured than ever. The silence had not been broken. It had only been disturbed, and whatever it concealed had stirred in answer. The morning after the raid, Savannah wore the look of a city that had glimpsed something it could not name. Those who had taken part staggered through the streets with hollow eyes, speaking little, their silence more eloquent than words. Neighbors pressed them for details, but most only shook their heads. A few muttered fragments, whispers in stone, shoes lined like offerings, a door that seemed to breathe. The more cautious denied everything, as though even recalling the images aloud risked inviting them back. Yet rumors multiplied with every retelling, filling the void left by the raiders' refusal to speak fully. The diocese moved with ruthless speed. By noon, carpenters under clerical orders were already repairing the chapel's doors, hammering fresh timbers into place as if to erase the very memory of the night. Notices were posted across Savannah declaring, "The raid a crime against God's house," and threatening excommunication for any who dared repeat the lies of agitators. Priests were instructed to denounce the event from their pulpits, painting the raiders as heretics who had endangered the community by bringing wrath upon themselves. Yet the authorities' haste to suppress only deepened suspicion. Families noticed how quickly the sheriff's men confiscated the broken lanterns and tools left behind. They watched as wagons rolled away from the chapel under cover of dawn, carrying crates whose contents were never revealed. Some swore they saw clerics loading small bundles wrapped in linen, as if removing evidence before anyone could inspect it. The secrecy fed the belief that something real, something material had been found below. In the days that followed, unease spread like a fever. Markets buzzed with talk of voices in wells, of livestock refusing to graze near the chapel yard, of children waking in the night, complaining of ringing in their ears. Whether these were coincidences or the product of suggestion hardly mattered. The town was primed to believe. Silence, once endured as an absence, had become an active menace. People now feared the hush of the chapel might seep outward, swallowing not just its congregants but the entire city. Artifacts from this period are telling. A set of unsigned broadsides circulated secretly, their words scrawled in charcoal rather than ink, perhaps to avoid tracing them to any printer. One broadside declared, "They bar the doors because they fear what lies within. The tower without bells is not mute, it is gagged." Another warned, "The children do not sleep. They are beneath us." Still, folded copies of these broadsides were found tucked into hymnals, slipped under doors, nailed discreetly to fence posts. Their language, raw and desperate, speaks to the paranoia taking hold. The raiders themselves suffered strange fates. Josiah Green, the carpenter who had described the carvings in the crypt, fell ill with fever days later. He raved of metal sounds in his dreams, of hammering that will not cease. He died within a fortnight. Others vanished from public life, retreating into their homes, refusing visitors. One man was said to have sealed his windows with boards, claiming the night air carried a resonance that seeks entry. The contrast between official calm and private terror grew unbearable. Priests preached of obedience and patience, yet empty pews told another story. Attendance at St. Perpetua's dwindled to almost nothing, while gatherings in private homes swelled. The people no longer trusted their shepherds. They trusted only each other, and even that bond frayed under the weight of fear. For Savannah, the raid was not merely a failed attempt at discovery. It was a revelation of another kind, proof that silence was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that recoiled from it. The iron door beneath the chapel became the town's unspoken obsession, a symbol of what they had dared to confront but could not overcome. In the space between suppression and rumor, fear metastasized into belief. By September, the city stood in a state of hushed dread. Bells tolled from other churches across Savannah, marking births, marriages, funerals. But from the tower of St. Perpetua's came nothing, only the heavy quiet that seemed to vibrate in men's bones. Each unspoken peal reminded them of what lay sealed below and of what might yet rise if the silence were broken. By late autumn of 1856, when Savannah's patience had worn itself raw, the diocese reluctantly summoned Dr. Horace Fielding back to the city. His first visit had ended with a polished report blaming hysteria and misadventure, but the raid had cracked that facade. Whispers of carvings, whispers of shoes, whispers of an iron door reached Philadelphia before the year was out. For all his skepticism, Fielding was no fool. He knew that if such details circulated unchecked, his reputation as a man of reason would be tarnished alongside the church that had hired him. So he returned, not as a savior summoned by faith, but as a man determined to preserve his authority. The Savannah he re-entered was not the same as the one he had left. The air of genteel silence, of neighbors willing to suppress doubt for the sake of civility, had curdled into mistrust. Fielding's journal notes the change. Every man looks over his shoulder, as though pursued. Women guard their children with more zeal than their coin. The word crypt is spoken in the way some utter devil. He found the people both desperate for explanation and unwilling to believe any offered by outsiders. They wanted truth, yes, but not one that denied what their own eyes and ears had glimpsed. Fielding began by demanding access to the chapel. The bishop resisted, citing sacrilege and the need to prevent further trespass. Only under pressure from the town council did he relent, granting Fielding a single day's entry, accompanied by 2 priests. Fielding brought instruments, tuning forks, a barometer, a simple contraption of glass tubes filled with mercury meant to register vibration. He hoped to demonstrate that the chapel's peculiar acoustics could be explained by natural resonance, that whispers and phantom sounds were mere tricks of echo and atmosphere. Yet the records he left tell a different story. In his notebook he writes, "Struck tuning fork thrice in nave, tone extinguished almost instantly, as though walls drank the sound. In crypt, same fork produced prolonged vibration in chest, though air remained still. Mercury trembled, though no draft detected. The contrast was undeniable. Visible stillness, but invisible agitation. His tools, meant to dispel superstition, confirmed that something was occurring beyond ordinary acoustics. The priests accompanying him grew agitated. They forbade him from examining the sealed iron door, steering him instead toward burial niches. Fielding pressed them, asking why the door was barred without hinges. Their evasions only deepened his suspicion. One priest muttered that the door keeps what should not spread. The phrase unsettled him enough that he recorded it verbatim. Later that night, in private, he coded a note in Latin. If their silence is shield, then bell is sword. They fear the strike more than the opening. Outside the chapel, Fielding interviewed surviving raiders, those willing to speak. Their testimonies aligned in disturbing ways. Several described the same resonance in their bones, the same impression of voices beneath the floor. One man swore his lantern flame had bent sideways toward the iron door, as though drawn by invisible breath. Fielding, ever cautious, labeled these shared hallucinations brought by expectation. Yet in the margins of his notes he scrawled, "But expectation does not make Mercury tremble." What truly unsettled him was the contrast between the diocese's posture and the townspeople's fear. The bishop insisted on obedience, on the preservation of order. But ordinary citizens spoke with the weight of lived experience. Mothers who woke to phantom lullabies, dock workers who swore the tide carried echoes from beneath the chapel, children who covered their ears at night, complaining of muffled bells no one else could hear. Science told him mass hysteria could explain these things. His instruments told him otherwise. When Fielding departed the chapel, crowds pressed around him demanding answers. He gave none. In public, he spoke only of further study and unfortunate agitation. Yet, his journal reveals a more personal confession. I find myself humming without willing it, always the same low note, the one the boys sang before they vanished. I cannot recall when it began, nor can I still it. Silence here is not absence. It is presence. That entry marks the turning point of his second visit. The alienist who once came to dismiss hysteria now found himself caught in its web. The diocese still demanded silence. The people demanded truth, and Fielding, trapped between them, began to glimpse that both were right in their own ways. Something lived within the absence, something that fed on muteness. The bells never cast had become more than missing metal. They had become the very boundary between concealment and revelation. The winter of 1856 bled into 1857 with a sickness that crept through Savannah like a shadow. At first, it resembled the fevers that came most summers with the mosquitoes. But this was the wrong season, the wrong air. It began with faint ringing in the ears, then nausea, then fevers that left victims delirious. Within a week, the afflicted either recovered with lingering weakness or slipped into death. No physician could name the malady, though they tried: malarial relapse, winter ague, consumption of a peculiar strain. None of their classifications fit. What disturbed the townspeople most was the pattern. The illness clustered around the streets nearest St. Perpetua's. Families, who lived within earshot of the Chapel's tower reported the earliest cases. Mothers swore their children fell ill after waking in the night to say they had heard the bell at last. Dockhands claimed the river carried a dull tolling at dawn, though no church nearby had rung. The contrast between medical explanations and lived testimony tore the city in two, doctors urging rationality on one side, grieving families swearing the chapel itself was the source on the other. Fielding, still in Savannah, documented these accounts meticulously. His notebooks from January 1857 contain dozens of interviews. One reads, "Child of 11 years, fever-stricken," repeats same phrase while half-conscious. "They are knocking. Knocking, knocking. No external sound detected." Another, "Mother describes hearing a low vibration in floorboards during child's fit. Lantern flame quivered though. Shutters closed." He did not publish these observations, but he preserved them, perhaps against his own better judgment. The diocese responded with a rigid calm that bordered on cruelty. Priests declared the fever a test of faith, insisting that talk of the chapel's influence was blasphemy. They organized processions to other churches, pointedly avoiding St. Perpetua's. Still, the absence of bells there grew unbearable. Funeral after funeral passed with tolls from distant parishes, but the mute tower loomed over the streets as if mocking the bereaved. Silence, once imposed as a safeguard, now seemed an accomplice to death. By February, the death toll climbed into dozens. Desperation eroded civility. One night, a group of fathers gathered at the edge of the chapel grounds, torches in hand, demanding the iron door be opened to release the sickness trapped below. They argued that air, uncirculated, must fester, that corpses or worse lay hidden. The bishop confronted them with armed deputies, declaring that to breach the crypt would doom not just Savannah but their souls. The confrontation nearly turned violent, but the torchbearers dispersed under threat of arrest. Artifacts from this period bear witness to the growing paranoia among the surviving. Pieces is a letter from a schoolmistress to her sister in Charleston. "We are instructed to walk past the chapel in silence. To speak is to invite suspicion. Yet the children whisper that they feel the floor vibrate when they pass, as though the earth keeps its own pulse. I confess I feel it too." Another relic is a physician's ledger, in which Dr. Abner Wells scrawled a chilling note beside a list of the dead. "Proximity to chapel, unavoidable. Pattern." He underlined the words 3 times. Fielding's own condition worsened. In one letter to a colleague, he admitted that he now hummed unconsciously, a low tone he could neither stop nor identify. He began to suspect he had been infected not by disease but by resonance itself. His rational mind framed it as suggestion, yet he could not deny its persistence. He wrote, "This is not illness but induction. We are made to vibrate with what lies below." The fever abated by spring as suddenly as it had begun, but the damage to Savannah's soul lingered. Dozens lay buried, their families convinced that silence had killed them. The chapel's doors remained barred, the tower mute, and in the void left by death, rumor flourished. Some claimed the dead could still be heard beneath the chapel at night, coughing, whispering, calling for bells that never rang. The contrast had never been sharper, officials declaring order restored, while ordinary citizens lived in terror of each creak, each gust of wind that carried the ghost of a toll. The fever had passed, but its resonance endured, feeding the conviction that something beneath the stones had awakened and would not be silenced forever. The spring of 1857 did not bring renewal to Savannah. It brought reckoning. The fever had broken, but grief smoldered into fury. Families who had buried their children no longer whispered their suspicions. They shouted them. Merchants refused to pay their pew rents. Fishermen cursed the name of St. Perpetua's openly on the docks, and women who had once knelt at the chapel's altar now crossed themselves hurriedly when they passed its gates. The contrast between the diocese's proclamations of calm and the city's raw grief finally tore apart what little trust remained. The trigger came one warm April evening when a blacksmith named Reuben Clark claimed to hear hammering from beneath the chapel as he worked late in his forge. The sound, he swore, matched his own strikes but lagged half a beat behind, as though echoing not through air but through earth. He told his neighbors, and by the next morning, half the street had gathered outside the chapel demanding entry. This time there would be no dispersal with threats. They came armed with axes, crowbars, and pistols. Fielding found himself pulled unwillingly into the storm. Though he had no wish to join a mob, many saw him as the only man who could speak sense with both the townsfolk and the bishop. They pressed him forward as mediator. But when he reached the chapel gates, he saw the futility of words. The people were beyond persuasion. They were gaunt with mourning, hollow with sleepless nights. Their grief hardened into resolve. The bishop stood at the threshold, flanked by deputies, his vestments gleaming in the sunlight as if armor. He raised a hand and declared that any who crossed the chapel's door would be damned. His voice, calm yet sharp, carried over the crowd. You do not know what you invite. To break this seal is to shatter your souls. But his warning struck sparks instead of fear. A mother whose daughter had died in the fever shouted back, Our souls are already shattered. The confrontation surged into chaos. The first blow came not from the mob, but from one of the deputies, who shoved a farmer aside with his rifle. The farmer swung his axe in response, and in an instant the crowd surged forward. Torches arced through the air, striking the chapel's outer doors. The deputies fought, but they were outnumbered. The bishop was pushed back into the nave as the mob poured inside. Fielding swept along with them despite his protests. What happened in those moments is described differently in every surviving account, but all agree on one detail. The iron door beneath the chapel was reached. Lanterns blazed in the crypt, their light falling once more on the sealed portal. Some swore the hinges had rusted deeper into stone, that the frame itself seemed to have grown since the last intrusion, as though the building had conspired to hold it fast. Others spoke of vibrations in the floor that rose with every shout and strike, until the air itself seemed to hum in resistance. Fielding, pressed against the wall, scribbled later that he felt the resonance as though inside my very ribs. He saw Reuben Clark strike, the iron with a hammer, each blow ringing like a muffled bell, each reverberation running not outward but inward into the stone. The mob shouted for more force, for fire, for powder if need be. The bishop, cornered at the steps, screamed at them to stop, but his words were drowned by the thunder of iron against iron. Then came the moment of collapse. Witnesses recalled a rush of air so sudden it extinguished half the lanterns at once. A groan reverberated through the crypt, not the groan of stone, but of something alive, vast and slow. The hammer fell from Reuben's hand as he staggered back, clutching his ears. Others dropped their tools, crying out as invisible pressure crushed their chests. One woman fainted. Another fled screaming that she heard her child's voice calling from the other side of the door. Panic scattered the mob as quickly as fury had gathered it. Some crawled toward the stairs, others clawed blindly in the dark. The deputies, themselves stricken, dropped their weapons and fled. Only Fielding and the bishop remained near the iron door. One man a skeptic undone, the other a believer vindicated by terror. In his notes, Fielding later admitted, I saw the bishop tremble, not in fear but in recognition. He knew this sound, this presence. He had always known. The mob dispersed into the streets, shaken, humiliated, but more convinced than ever that the chapel held something that could not be ignored. The raid had not breached the seal, but it had stripped away the last remnants of Savannah's obedience. The people no longer saw their priests as protectors. They saw them as jailers guarding a silence that killed. And for Fielding, the confrontation left no refuge. He had witnessed enough to know he could no longer explain it away as mass hysteria. He had felt the resonance in his own body, had seen men reduced to collapse by a force unseen. His science faltered before the evidence, while the bishop's faith offered no comfort, only warnings. Between them lay a truth neither dared fully name. In the aftermath of the second raid, Savannah awoke to a strange quiet, the kind that follows violence but precedes reckoning. The people returned to their homes, shaken, some ashamed, most embittered. But the diocese did not allow even the smallest ember of dissent to smolder. Within days, proclamations were posted on every corner. The chapel of St. Perpetua's was declared off-limits to all but clergy. Any further trespass would be met not just with arrest, but with excommunication. Names of those identified in the raid, farmers, merchants, mothers, even the blacksmith Reuben Clark, were read aloud from other pulpits, each branded a disturber of holy peace. It was an erasure disguised as discipline, a way of severing the offenders from the communal life that bound Savannah together. Excommunication in that era was not just spiritual, it was social death. Merchants refused to extend credit. Neighbors crossed the street rather than exchange greetings. Children of the condemned were quietly excluded from school. Families who had buried their loved ones in the fever now found themselves banished from worship and commerce alike. It was a cruelty sharper than mourning. The diocese insisted such measures preserved order, but to the people it felt like punishment layered atop punishment, as though grief itself had become a crime. The bishop ordered all surviving records of the raid confiscated. Broadside printers were raided by deputies, papers seized. At least one schoolmaster was questioned for copying testimonies into his own ledger. Even Dr. Abner Wells, who had dared note the proximity of the fever to the chapel, found his ledger scrutinized. The offending lines were inked out by clerical decree, replaced with the official verdict of winter ague. Silence was reimposed not as absence, but as active repression, a tightening noose around both memory and dissent. But Fielding, ever meticulous, ever divided, did not yield so easily. Recognizing that open defiance would mean the end of his career and perhaps his life, he turned instead to secrecy. He began assembling what he called a codex, a dossier of observations, testimonies and artifacts, hidden within an ordinary physician's notebook. The pages alternated between harmless notes on melancholia and nervous afflictions, and coded entries that required both Latin reversal and simple substitution ciphers to decipher. Within these hidden sections he preserved the most damning details: the trembling mercury in his instruments, the journal fragments of Father Ambrose, the words spoken by the bishop in the crypt when the resonance nearly felled them all. One chilling entry reads, "I no longer trust my ears, for they hum unbidden. Yet I trust the pattern. Each attempt at breach brings illness. Each illness yields silence. There is design, though I cannot name its author." Another, written weeks later. Their excommunications cut the flesh from the city, but still the wound hums beneath. Savannah is hollowed, yet still it vibrates. The contrast between the official record and Fielding's secret codex could not be starker. In diocesan annals, 1857 is described as a year of discipline and renewed obedience. In Fielding's ciphered notes, it is marked as the year the city itself began to rot from enforced silence. He, who had once arrived to dispel superstition, had become the unwilling archivist of what superstition could not explain. Artifacts from this phase testify to the dual reality. Surviving excommunication decrees, brittle with age, list names in neat ink beneath the seal of the diocese, each line a scar on a family's history. In contrast, tucked within the Hanley trunk decades later, scholars found Fielding's codex, its cipher broken only after patient effort. Where the church proclaimed peace, the codex whispered turmoil. Where the priests erased, Fielding preserved. Savannah staggered beneath this division. Some bent under the weight of excommunication, crawling back to obedience. Others fled the city altogether, taking their stories with them into the hinterlands. But the silence of St. Perpetua's remained, a void at the heart of Savannah that no proclamation could erase. The people may have been forced into silence, but the stones, and those who dared to listen, still spoke. It was in the summer of 1857, just as the city seemed to have resigned itself to enforced silence, that the earth itself broke faith with the diocese. A storm swept through Savannah in late June, a violent squall that cracked shutters and toppled trees, though it lasted scarcely an hour. When morning came, the damage seemed ordinary: fallen branches, flooded gutters, until the sexton of St. Perpetua's reported that part of the chapel's floor had collapsed. The damage was confined to the rear transept, where the stone had caved inward as though pulled down from below. Splintered pews lay at odd angles, the flagstones shattered into jagged fragments. At the center gaped a black pit, 10 feet across, its edges raw with freshly broken stone. Witnesses described the air that rose from it as breathless but charged, warm despite the storm's cool aftermath. The bishop forbade anyone from approaching. But word spread swiftly, and within hours townsfolk crowded outside the gates, straining for glimpses of the wound in their sanctuary. The diocese moved with uncharacteristic haste. Carpenters were summoned under cover of night, tasked with boarding over the gap. But the damage was too severe, and the boards warped against an unseen current of air rising steadily from the pit. It was not foul-smelling, but it carried a resonance, an almost imperceptible vibration that made lantern flames flutter and loose, nails tremble in their beams. One carpenter fled in the middle of the work, declaring he heard voices beneath the boards. His companions claimed he had only panicked, but none volunteered to take his place. Fielding, of course, demanded access. His petition to the bishop was at first denied, but the growing clamor of townspeople forced a concession. The city wanted an explanation. Why had the chapel's stones, which had stood a century, suddenly betrayed their weight? Why did the air above the pit hum faintly, even when the city lay quiet? The bishop relented, allowing Fielding a brief examination under guard. His notes from that day remain some of the most unsettling entries in his codex. Pit descends deeper than light will penetrate. Drop pebble, no echo of impact. Air, rising continuous, as though from lungs of earth. Instruments register vibration at constant pitch, just below threshold of hearing. In chest, sensation of tolling bell without sound. He wrote of lanterns flickering, of deputies shifting uneasily, of one priest who fell to his knees and began reciting prayers until, silenced by the bishop's glare, the bishop, faced with undeniable evidence, chose denial all the same. He ordered the pit sealed, not studied, not acknowledged, but entombed. Stonemasons were brought to lay heavy blocks across the gap, and mortar was mixed thick to hold them. During the work, one mason cut his hand on the stone and later swore the wound sang for days after, a phantom ache that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. He abandoned his tools and refused further payment, walking away from the city entirely. The diocese declared the collapse an accident of drainage, assuring the faithful that no danger remained. Yet the people were not convinced. Rumors spread faster than proclamations. Some said the storm had not caused the collapse, but released what the iron door could no longer contain. Others whispered that the missing children had clawed their way upward, only to be buried once more beneath new stone. The contrast between official dismissal and private terror widened into a chasm. Artifacts of this episode survive in curious forms. A ledger from a stonemasons guild records unusually high payments, made in July 1857, though no new buildings were commissioned that season. A surviving scrap of the collapsed flagstone, later preserved in a private collection, bears faint grooves on its underside, markings some believe are deliberate, though weathered nearly beyond recognition. And in Fielding's codex, a final cryptic line: "The ground does not collapse, it yields." The collapse marked the diocese's last serious attempt to maintain control. Their silence had been enough when disappearances were scattered rumors, when illness could be dismissed as fever. But now stone itself testified, opening its mouth in the heart of the chapel. Though they sealed it with haste, the memory of that gaping pit could not be boarded over. Savannah had seen into the silence, and nothing the bishop decreed could unmake that vision. The collapse of the chapel floor was the breaking point for Savannah. What the diocese tried to call an accident of drainage lingered in memory as something closer to revelation. The citizens had seen the wound in their sanctuary, a pit that no stone or proclamation could truly conceal. Even after the masons sealed it, the story of that dark cavity rippled outward through the markets, the docks, the parlors of the wealthy, until the city itself seemed split in two. Those who still bowed to the bishop's decrees, and those who whispered that St. Perpetua's was no church at all but a prison. Families began to leave. Some sold their holdings in haste. Others abandoned homes overnight, taking only what they could carry. The roads toward Augusta and Charleston filled with wagons, their passengers citing ill health, business, opportunities, or family obligations, but all carried the same haunted look, the same reluctance to speak aloud of what they truly feared. Those who remained in Savannah lived as though under occupation, avoiding the chapel's quarter, forbidding children to play near its shadow, shunning the very streets that led to its mute tower. The bells of other churches tolled on, but each note rang like a cruel reminder of what St. Perpetua's withheld. Whispered heresies spread in the void left by flight and fear. Some said the silence was not divine but demonic, that the church had bound a force beneath the stones long ago and now dared not let it out. Others claimed the missing children were not lost but transformed, turned into something that sustained the resonance itself. The boldest whispered that the priests themselves were servants of the silence, feeding it with obedience and grief. These ideas were rarely spoken in daylight, but they crept into nighttime gatherings, into the muttered prayers of widows, into the fearful stories told to hushed children. The diocese struck back with even harsher measures. Deputies patrolled streets near the chapel, arresting anyone caught loitering. Priests thundered from pulpits about loyalty, obedience, and damnation for those who spread lies against the house of God, yet their words rang hollow. The contrast between their thunderous sermons and the unbroken muteness of the chapel tower only made their control seem brittle. A church without bells could not outshout the silence it sought to contain. Meanwhile, Fielding retreated into secrecy. The collapse had confirmed what his instruments had only hinted. Something below St. Perpetua's resisted containment. A force that moved not through air but through stone, blood, and memory. He began preparing the final draft of his codex, layering its entries with even more intricate ciphers, aware that discovery meant ruin. He included transcripts of interviews with excommunicated families, sketches of the collapsed transept, even a rough chart marking fever deaths against distance from the chapel. In one passage he admitted, "The silence propagates like a contagion, yet behaves like sound. To call it natural is folly, to call it divine is worse." His final entries grow disjointed, half medical case notes, half confessions. He described hearing the phantom toll now not only at night but in daylight. A vibration in his jaw when he spoke, in his chest when he breathed. He confessed he sometimes matched his steps to the rhythm, as though unwillingly drawn into cadence. In one chilling line he wrote, "I fear I am already part of the resonance, that by listening I have become its instrument." And then the record falters. Sometime in the autumn of 1857, Fielding disappears from Savannah's archives. No obituary marks his passing, no ship's log records his departure. The diocese does not mention him again, as though he had never been summoned a second time. His codex, concealed in the trunk of Margaret Hanley, is all that remains. The city limped on, but diminished. Commerce slowed as families fled, and the shadow of St. Perpetua's spread wider than its walls. Some called it a curse, others a judgment, still others a truth no one dared name. But all agreed that Savannah was not the same. A chapel without bells had become a city without voice. By the spring of 1858, the diocese moved decisively to cauterize the wound that St. Perpetua's had become. Records were gathered, confiscated, or sealed away. Parish ledgers from the year of the collapse bear abrupt gaps, as if whole weeks had vanished. Coroner's reports that once listed unexplained illnesses were recopied in a neat hand, amended to read fever or consumption. Even birth and marriage. Registries were pared down, entries blotted or replaced with more convenient names. The official history of Savannah was made to flow around the chapel, like water skirting a stone. What could not be rewritten was buried. The building itself was shuttered. Heavy doors barred its entrance, and patrols turned away the curious. The bell tower remained mute, a black silhouette against the sky, its emptiness a monument more potent than any sermon. The townspeople avoided it, yet its presence infected conversation. Travelers remarked on it with unease, asking why such a structure stood silenced, in a city otherwise alive with church bells. Guides offered shallow explanations. Structural weakness, out of repair. But their eyes betrayed something deeper. The survivors who had lost children, siblings, or health to the silence found themselves divided. Some clung to the diocese, desperate to believe that obedience would buy safety. Others withdrew into private rituals, placing candles at doorsteps, sewing iron into clothing, keeping diaries of symptoms they feared were more than fever. And some left entirely, scattering across the south, carrying fragments of the story with them. It was these fragments that would later resurface in the margins of newspapers, in the journals of travelers, in Fielding's ciphered codex, piecing together the shadowed history the diocese tried to erase. The most chilling aspect of this erasure was not the destruction of records, but their selective preservation. In the diocesan archives, later uncovered by researchers, sat a box labeled simply Perpetua, sealed. Within were inventories of confiscated letters, lists of families relocated, a set of sketches of the collapsed transept, and a single page bearing only 2 words: never again. No explanation accompanied the phrase, no signature, no date. It was not confession nor command, but something in between, a recognition perhaps, that the silence was larger than any one city or generation. And so the question remained, what had been contained beneath those stones? Was the silence an echo of natural resonance, an anomaly misunderstood as divine? Or was it something older, a force that fed on obedience and fear, demanding ritual and secrecy to remain undisturbed? The contrast between what was claimed and what was concealed grew into a rift that no archive could mend. For the families who lost children, for the men who fled the pit's hum, for Fielding whose notes dissolved into confession, the truth was not theoretical. It was lived. In later years, Savannah would reinvent itself, painting over the scars of cholera, war, and fire. But the chapel remained, hollow, sealed, standing in refusal of sound. The silence itself became its only bell, tolling not with iron but with memory. Travelers who passed too near spoke of a pressure in the chest, a vibration in the teeth, a fleeting impression of a sound never heard yet deeply known. The city moved on, but it did not forget. Which leaves us, the inheritors of these fragments, with a choice. We can read the silence as safeguard, that some truths, once glimpsed, must remain sealed to spare the living, or we can read it as suffocation, an institution's power choking off testimony, forcing survivors into exile, and erasing children into ledgers of fever. The chapel without bells stands at the intersection of these readings, its mute tower pointing not to heaven, but to the failure of human guardianship. The question is not whether the silence was real, but whether we can bear what it demanded. Would unsealing the stones grant release, or only awaken what those priests worked so desperately to bury? In that unresolved tension lies the echo that reaches us still. If you have listened this far, the question turns to you. In your own life, in your own town, do you believe silence is protection or complicity? And if the bells were to toll at last, would we be ready to hear them?